I have three very important, part of my mathematical framing, but metrics that I use in terms of how my Christian walk. One is love. Two is forgiveness. And three is, from James, be slow to anger. And I'll try to explain each one. The one is, I've come to understand love from a framing of the way God loved me. So I know I was a pagan. Some of you won't admit it, but I was a straight pagan, okay? I mean, I was living the life, doing me, all right? I know the things that I've done. I'm not bragging about it. It's horrible, okay?
We get the point.
Okay. I just don't want anybody to think I'm glamorizing sin. But my point is that there's a God that forgave me for what I have done and is willing to love me. What's expected of me is to sort of be a type in the shadow. I'm not perfect, but I need to display a similar type of love. And I need to be able to forgive in that way, which means I have to manage my anger or my flesh. And I have to be slow to anger. Many of us get upset about small microaggressions. Not minimizing your microaggressions, but I helped coin that term a long time ago in the CRT world, the critical race theory world. Right. So I never thought it was going to become the lexicon of every college student who gets their foot stepped on. But the thing is, if you don't manage that anger, and the only way for me to manage it is to say to myself, God probably was pretty angry with you, but he still loved you and forgave you. You've got to find a way to do that. You have to forgive much because much was forgiven of you. So to your question about the folks there, it was theirs to forgive. And if they had a saving faith in Christ, and they know that their lives weren't perfect, and they were offering up forgiveness to someone who took the lives of their loved ones, I think they were displaying a Christ-like love. It's not anything that I would expect someone to understand who might not be a believer, but I think I understand it.
Wahneema, what was your reaction?
Yeah, I had a number of different reactions. The most immediate reaction was that it would be impertinent for me to have a judgment about what people in those circumstances should feel or do or say. And then on the heels of that, I also thought about something that had happened, within my family. My oldest brother, who after my father's death came back from the military and sort of stepped into my father's role to take care of us. He was 14 or 15 years older than I was. He was murdered in Washington, D.C. He worked at a liquor store. And he worked at a liquor store in a part of the boundary area between Northwest and Northeast. And this is 22 years ago. In a black working class / middle class neighborhood where he was committed both to the neighborhood, to his job in the liquor store, to the little tiny strip where the liquor store was. It included a laundromat, a drugstore, and a tiny little grocery store. And at the time that he first started working there, which was maybe 25 years before he was murdered, I was returning to undergrad school. I was an undergrad at Howard by then, and I had my son. I had divorced my husband. And I worked full time, so in order to do library work and to do, the kind of errands that I needed to do on weekends, I would drop my son off at the liquor store with my older brother, Lenny, and Lenny would take care of my son. And this went on for the years that it took me to finish my undergrad degree. So by the time he died in 1993, I was an assistant professor at Princeton. And, I got the news that he had been murdered, and the neighborhood by then had changed drastically. And it was It was still a black poor neighborhood, but it was no longer a neighborhood that was knit together by certain common interests. It had become hideously fractured, by poverty and by everything that goes with it. When we heard the news that he was murdered, we heard it from the family for whom he worked. The store was owned by a Korean-American family. And Lenny was close to that family. He used to go on fishing trips with the father who owned the liquor store and one of the nephews who worked in the liquor store with him. The gangbangers who came into the liquor store to rob it shot the nephew first, and he died instantly. The father of the family that owned the store was in the back, in the warehouse part of it, and Lenny was out front, and Lenny was shot, but he didn't die immediately. So when the owner came out, he saw his nephew, who was clearly gone, but Lenny still lingered, so Lenny died in his arms. And through that period of time, I had already been, as a young person in the 20s, I'd already been working on prison parole, work. I had been helping prisoners get their GED, their general education equivalency diplomas. But by the time I was an assistant professor, I wasn't necessarily doing that work on a daily basis, but I had become more interested in prison abolition and restorative justice. So when Lenny was murdered, I was confronted with my own anger and my sadness and my difficulties in talking with my family, they were all completely wrapped up in their anger, and I was trying to explain that the anger was insufficient. It wasn't doing as much for me as I hoped it would do. It wasn't blotting out all the pain. And so I was trying to tell them that I needed something more, especially because I really was committed to the idea of restorative justice. And I knew that they weren't, but I at least thought that if I talked about it, I could put something together that would help me get through that moment. And I wasn't able to put something together, so I was still kind of adrift with the pain, but at the same time, I believed in the idea of restorative justice. I just didn't know how to get from the pain to restorative justice. And it took me a long time to do that work, but over the course of the years that it took to do that work, I became much less judgmental about the way people expressed their grief. I understood that grief itself had its own long trajectory, and that what happened in a moment did not define everything that you were feeling. So to get back to the families who say, I forgive the killers, not only do I think that it's impertinent for me or for anyone to have an evaluation of that, I think that it's a stumbling block for imagining possibilities if we think only about the moment of grief. People say and do and feel what they need to say and do and feel. And I even understand a strategy of saying, I am still here as a thinking, feeling, loving individual, and that murder does not erase those things. So I've tried to find a way when I'm talking to people who have been critical of this to separate out being critical of the work that the media does by instantly producing a narrative of what good black people ought to do, right? So the number of people who ran around with microphones who would throw them in front of people's faces and say, yeah, but do you forgive the person who did this to them? I would have, a real old-fashioned adolescent response, and I'd hold up a middle finger and say, this is not your work to do. This is not what you should be obliging people to do, which is to produce yet another narrative that black people are supposed to meet, match, and articulate.